writing in the Spanish language, whose work he liked to follow, were J.M. Coetzee and me. So we have at least in common the approval of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, which is something to have. No, I think there's one thing I wanted to say that is very different, I think, between his sensibility and my own, which is I think that the magic of 100 Years of Solitude is that it privileges the religious village, old-fashioned life worldview over the modern technological urban worldview. So that in Macondo, when Remedios, the beauty, rises into heaven amidst the laundry, everybody says, oh, well, she was always too good for this world. We expected something like that to happen to her. And it's treated like a kind of matter-of-fact occurrence. And yet the things that really the people in Macondo find weird are the arrivals of technology. So there's actually my favorite line in the whole novel is the moment at which the first railway train comes to Macondo. And this woman comes running, screaming down the street in fear. And when she's asked what's coming, what's behind her, she says, something's coming. She says, something terrible. It's like a kitchen dragging a village behind it. And so that inversion to make technology, urbanism, the modern world, that's what's weird. And this other, more eternal world is what's real. That's his flip. That's the flip which creates the magical effect of Garcia Marquez. And I think of myself as not like that at all. I think of myself as an urban novelist. If I'm anything at all, I'm a writer of big cities. And I've lived all my life in 3 gigantic and somewhat similar cities, Bombay, London, New York. And I think the way in which I think and understand the world comes out of that very urban experience. So that, I think, is just a way in which I see a difference between us, but I have unreserved admiration for him.
How do borders and frontiers enter into your work?
I think any of us who were born in the immediate aftermath of the partition of the Indian subcontinent learned, from the moment we could think about the consequences of constructing frontiers, where there were none before. The incredible bloodbath that took place around the newly created borders between India and Pakistan, gave one a sense of not just the importance, but also, if you like, the danger of the idea of the border, of the frontier. I remember when I first went to England to go to school when I was just 14 years old, in early 1961. The first major political event that took place after I arrived in the West was the construction of the Berlin Wall. And I remember feeling, as somebody growing up in the aftermath of the partition of India and Pakistan, to see a partition being erected in Europe was genuinely horrifying. I thought, don't they understand what happens if you do this? And so I remember being very, very struck as a 14-year-old boy by the building of the Berlin Wall. And so that idea of the frontier and what it can mean, is something I've tried to explore. The frontier can be a place constructed to keep people out, or it can be a place constructed to hold people in. Or, of course, the much more optimistic American definition of the frontier is the idea of constant renewal and discovery and possibility. And as is very well known, through the frontier thesis of Frederick Jackson Turner, that the idea that America, in a way, defined itself by this constantly moving frontier, and it constantly had, and in a way, the definitions of America in that period were created at the frontier with its engagement with the unknown. For good and ill. And as we know, President Kennedy, when he initiated the space program, referred to it as a new frontier. And you could say that a country which has defined itself through that kind of frontier spirit finds a difficulty when there is no longer a frontier to go beyond. And suddenly the frontiers of this country become very different. They become places where you have to be careful, and you have to not let the wrong people in. This is after the opposite message was inscribed on the Statue of Liberty. So it's a very complex subject, and therefore very rich and kind of inexhaustible subject. And in my own life, of course, I am the product of a movement across a whole number of frontiers. I'm sitting here talking to you in English, accented English, having grown up speaking Urdu and now living in New York. So I'm completely the product of such an act of movement. And it came very early to seem to me that the phenomenon of mass migration in the second half of the 20th century is of profound consequence for the nature of how we live in the world, because it simply means that we live in a time in which more people have moved across borders than in the entire history of the world up to that point. It has been the age of the migrant, and this is partly because of the creation of the means to do it, not just ships, but airplanes, but also, of course, in many cases, the necessity, whether it was Nazi Germany, whether it was the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, whether it was, there have been many reasons why people have had to flee, and then there has been, of course, the economic pull as well. But this phenomenon of people no longer living in the place from which they came has been enormously magnified in the last half century. And that's why it comes back to what I was saying about being an urban writer, because one of the characteristics of the big city, wherever it is, whichever big city it is that usually a majority of the people who live in that city were not born in it. That they come to it, not necessarily from another country, but they come to it to seek their fortune. And so the city is the location and the creation, if you like, of migrants. New York City more than anywhere else, perhaps. And so it is a kind of big subject for me, and I've tried and repeated. I mean, actually, a novel you didn't mention, the question I didn't mention, The Ground Beneath Her Feet, is a novel which is really about that process of moving across the world. And I don't know that I've finished dealing with it yet. The Enchantress of Florence is about a journey from the east to the west, and another one back from the west to the east. So I don't seem to be able to stop.
How is art related to journalism and politics?
There are many different ways of constructing the real, and journalism is one way, imaginative fiction is another way, and the political process is a third way. And in many cases there are conflicts between these because people's intentions and motivations are at odds with each other. It's easier to see this when you oppose politicians and writers because, I mean, to put it crudely, serious literature has at its purpose the unfolding of truth, the exposition of as much truth as you can manage to unfold. The purpose of political language is often the opposite. It is to conceal the truth, or at least to varnish the truth over with something which makes it more palatable that people might vote for. And so there becomes a natural conflict between the way language is used, between political language and literary language, let's say. I mean, it's more complicated when you talk about different kinds of writing, because the problem of journalism is that it appears to be factual, but very often is limited by the difficulty, in fact, of knowing what happened. So So it is very difficult for journalists, very often, and increasingly difficult, I believe, in our world, to actually find out what's going on. And so what they offer as fact is, in fact, is problematic, let's say. It can't, it presents itself as solid, but in fact, it's not as solid as it seems. And simply, if you look at the way in which a particular news story is reported over time, you see how what were apparent facts are constantly being replaced by, as knowledge increases. And an example of this was the reporting, the day-by-day reporting of the terrorist attack in Bombay at the end of last year, where it was very difficult in those days, when the terrorists were inside the hotels and so on, really to know what was going on, or indeed who they were, or how many of them there were, or what kind of weapons they had, or how they communicated, or who they were killing or not killing, etc. And the story changed every 5 seconds. I mean, there were news reports which said that most of the terrorists had British passports. And that almost created an international incident. And then the next day, they didn't have British passports. They had Pakistani passports, which created a different kind of international incident. Then there was a story about how many, that there were really a lot of them. There were sort of like 40 or 50 of them. And then at the end of the siege, it turned out that there were only a dozen of them, of whom one had been captured alive. And then there was a story that no, there had been more of them, but lots of them escaped, so there might be more attacks. And then there was another story which said, no, that wasn't true, they were all dead. So, and each of these was presented as a factual statement in its turn, even though the subsequent story completely unmade the factuality of the previous story. So it's that the problem of, and I don't mean to say that journalists do this in bad faith. I just mean that the nature of the job is such that the kind of information you can discover is often incomplete, and yet the way in which it's often presented is as if it's authoritative. And that is very tricky ground. And literature, imaginative literature, creates reality in a different way. It doesn't seek to have, if you like, journalistic, verifiable veracity. It tries to create the real by, well, what is truth in fiction? I mean, what is the truth of the tale? It's clearly something other than objective truth. It has much more to do with felt truth, with emotional truth. That when you read the world described in a certain way, you feel, yes, the world is like that. Or I never realized the world was like that, but now I feel it may be. And those are the kind of responses that literature asks you for. And that's the kind of truth that art can offer. And now, of course, the problem is that there's a great overlap between these things. There's a lot of literature which uses journalistic elements, and particularly in the aftermath of the creation of the new journalism by such people as Tom Wolfe and George Plimpton, journalism became more and more novelistic. So if you look at a book like like The Right Stuff, I mean, it tries to achieve truth by very similar means to the means that novelists use. And so there's a kind of blending. But I was just trying to say that there are these essential differences, and sometimes those are conflicts.
Well, I believe we are out of time now. So I did want to thank Sir Salman Rushdie for his presence and for his